Helen's trembling hands found the piano keys for the first time in 20 years, and when the first chord echoed through the packed auditorium, the ensuing silence was more deafening than any applause she had ever received. But to understand how the 52-year-old woman, dressed in her worn-out cleaning uniform, had arrived on that stage under the unforgiving spotlight, we need to go back 3 months, when her life seemed to have reached the very bottom of the deepest well a human soul could dig. The smell of disinfectant had become part of Helen's skin, ingrained in every pore after 10 years of cleaning the hallways of the Virtuoso School of Music, one of the most prestigious music institutions in the country. It was the early morning as she pushed her cart through the silent corridors, her footsteps echoing on the polished marble that reflected the dim hallway lights. In this environment where music was treated as a religion, Helen was merely a shadow that went unnoticed, invisible to the eyes of the students and professors who hurried by during the day. On the morning of that Tuesday in March, Helen was finishing her shift when she heard firm footsteps approaching. Maestro Claudio Mendoza, the school's director, walked by with his impeccable suit and erect posture that intimidated even the most experienced professors. His cold eyes scanned Helen from head to toe with the disdain reserved for those he considered irrelevant. "Helen, isn't it?" The man's sharp voice made her flinch slightly. "I need to talk to you about some issues that have come to my attention." Helen's heart pounded. In a decade of work, she had never received a single complaint. She always kept herself discreet, efficient, and respectful to everyone around her. "Some professors reported that you have been seen observing the classes." Claudio paused deliberately, as if savoring each word. "I want to make it clear that your job here is to clean, not to entertain yourself with activities that are far beyond your comprehension." Helen's cheeks burned. All these years she had indeed stopped for a few minutes to listen to the classes while cleaning the rooms. The music that leaked through the doors was like fresh water to a thirsty soul in the desert. But she never imagined anyone had noticed. "I'm sorry, sir, that wasn't my intention," Helen began. But Claudio raised his hand to silence her. "I don't want apologies. I want guarantees that this won't happen again. You have a family to support, don't you?" The veiled threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. "It would be a shame if we needed to reassess your position here." Helen nodded silently, swallowing the humiliation that rose in her throat like bitter bile. Claudio walked away without another word, leaving her alone in the corridor, with the echo of his shoes resonating like hammers against her dignity. That night, Helen arrived at the small apartment she shared with her 17-year-old daughter, Sophia. The place was modest, but clean and organized with the same care she dedicated to the school. Sophia was at the kitchen table, surrounded by books and notebooks, preparing for her college entrance exams. "How was work today, Mom?" Sophia asked, looking up from the yellowed pages of a literature book borrowed from the library. Helen forced a smile, keeping the humiliation that still burned in her chest like a branding iron to herself. "Everything normal, dear. How are your studies going?" "Well, but," Sophia hesitated, biting her lower lip. "Mom, do you remember when I was little and you played those beautiful songs on Grandma's piano?" The question hit Helen like a punch to the stomach. 20 years had passed since she last played the piano. 20 years since she had abandoned her dreams to raise Sophia alone, after her husband left them when he found out he was going to be a father. "It was just playing around, Sophia. I never played anything serious, but it was so beautiful." Sophia sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if you didn't lose something important when you stopped." Helen looked away, pretending to organize papers on the table. The truth was that she had lost much more than Sophia could imagine. She had lost the version of herself who dreamed of being a concert pianist, who spent hours practicing scales and studies, who felt her heart race every time she performed in recitals at music college. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. Claudio's cruel words echoed in her mind, mingling with memories she had buried 2 decades ago. She got up silently and went to the small closet in the bedroom. At the back, behind old clothes and dusty boxes, she found a worn leather folder. Inside, the yellowed scores whispered forgotten promises: Chopin, Bach, Debussy, names that once made her heart sing, now just ghosts of paper. Her hands trembled as she touched the score of Chopin's Nocturne Op. 9, No. 2. She used to play this piece with a passion that made people stop to listen, tears welling up in their eyes without knowing why. The music flowed through her like blood in her veins, each note an extension of her soul. A flashback transported her back to her 22-year-old self. She was on the stage of the university auditorium, wearing a simple but elegant navy blue dress. The audience was small, but respectful. When her fingers touched the first notes of the nocturne, the world around her disappeared. There was only her and the music, dancing together in an eternal waltz. At the end of the performance, the silence lasted several seconds before exploding into warm applause. Her piano professor, Maestro Roberto, approached afterward with tears in his eyes. "Helen, you have a rare gift, an emotional connection to music that can't be taught. You should seriously consider pursuing a career as a concert pianist." But then came the unexpected pregnancy, the fiancé's abandonment, the need to work to support a child. Her dreams were folded like the sheet music in that leather portfolio and tucked away in the back of a closet, where they remained for 2 decades. The next day, Helen returned to work determined to become even more invisible. She avoided the hallways where classes were held, kept her eyes down, and worked in absolute silence. But it was like trying to hold her breath. The music leaking through the walls seemed to pursue her, calling to something deep and dormant within her soul. It was on a Thursday night that everything changed. Helen was cleaning the Mozart room, the school's main auditorium, when she heard raised voices coming from the hallway. She hid behind the side curtains of the stage as Claudio entered, accompanied by 2 men in suits. "The problem is serious," Claudio said, his footsteps echoing through the empty auditorium. "The principal pianist of the State Symphony Orchestra canceled tomorrow's performance. Urgent family matter. We have a full house, important critics confirmed, and now this. Is there no one who can replace her?" one of the men asked, clearly nervous. "In one night, to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, Claudio laughed bitterly. "There are no miracles in the world of classical music. We'll have to cancel and deal with the public embarrassment." Helen's heart pounded. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. She knew every note of that piece. She had obsessively studied it for months in college. It was one of the most challenging compositions in the piano repertoire, but also one of the most beautiful and emotionally devastating. The men left, leaving the auditorium silent. Helen remained hidden for several minutes, fighting against an impulse that grew in her chest like a storm. When she finally emerged from behind the curtains, the empty stage stretched before her like an irresistible invitation. The Steinway grand piano rested in the center of the stage, its black and white keys gleaming under the soft stage lights. Helen approached slowly, as if approaching a sacred altar. Her hands trembled as they touched the polished wood of the lid. For a moment, 20 years of silence weighed on her like a mountain. But then, almost against her will, her fingers found the keys. The first note echoed through the empty auditorium, pure and crystalline. The second followed, then the third, and then the floodgates opened. Helen's hands moved over the keys, as if they had never stopped playing. Chopin's Nocturne flowed from her with an emotional intensity that brought tears to her eyes, which fell onto the ivory keys. Each note carried 2 decades of buried dreams, of silent sacrifices, of a passion that had refused to die despite all the abandonment. She didn't notice when Claudio returned to the auditorium. She didn't see him stop at the entrance, speechless, immediately recognizing the technical skill and emotional depth of what she was playing. She didn't notice when he silently approached, struggling to process the impossible reality before him. Only when the last note faded into silence did Helen open her eyes and see Claudio standing a few feet from the stage. The man's face had lost all its arrogance, replaced by something she couldn't immediately identify. It was astonishment, admiration, and a hint of shame. Helen stood up quickly, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. I'll finish cleaning, and wait." Claudio's voice was softer than Helen had ever heard it. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Helen lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of the humiliation from days ago returning. "It's nothing, sir. It was just—" "Don't tell me it's nothing." Claudio mounted the stage, approaching the piano. "I've been teaching music for 30 years. I recognize genuine talent when I hear it." "You have classical training, don't you?" The question hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds. Helen wrestled with herself, part of her wanting to run away, part of her tired of hiding who she really was. "I studied at the University of Music," she finally murmured. "But that was a long time ago. Why did you stop?" The simple question carried immense weight. Helen felt her eyes filling with tears. "Life happened. I had to choose between my daughter and my dreams." Claudio remained silent for a long moment, processing the revelation. When he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, a humanity that Helen had never noticed before. "The Rachmaninoff Concerto," he said slowly. "You know it." Helen nodded, not trusting her own voice. "Our pianist canceled. The performance is tomorrow night." Claudio looked her directly in the eyes. "I need someone who can play that piece with the orchestra." Helen's world stopped. For a moment, she couldn't process what she had heard. "Sir, I haven't played in 20 years. I clean floors. I can't." "You can," Claudio interrupted. "I just heard you. You not only can but should. Would you like to try? And what if I told you stories like this happen every day, that hidden talents wait for an opportunity, waiting for someone to believe in them? If you also believe in the power of dreams that refuse to die, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, because every time we share these stories, we are planting a seed of hope in the heart of someone who needs to believe that it's never too late to start over. Shall we continue this journey together? The next 24 hours passed like a whirlwind. Helen barely slept, alternating between absolute panic and an excitement she hadn't felt in decades. Sophia was astonished when her mother told her what had happened. "Mom, this is incredible," the girl exclaimed, hugging Helen tightly. "I always knew you were special. What if I forget everything? What if my hands don't obey anymore? What if I disappoint everyone?" Helen's insecurities spilled out like pent-up water. "What if everything goes right?" Sophia held her mother's face in her hands. "What if this is your second chance?" The morning of the performance, Helen arrived at the school earlier than usual. Claudio had arranged a rehearsal room where she could practice before the orchestra rehearsal. Her hands were stiff at first, 2 decades of disuse taking their toll, but gradually, muscle memory awakened. The scales flowed, the arpeggios came alive, and music became her native language again. The orchestra rehearsal was tense. The musicians, initially skeptical about the last-minute replacement, soon realized they were facing someone special. The conductor, initially worried, smiled for the first time upon hearing Helen play the cadenza of the first movement. "It's as if the music is telling a story through you," he commented during the break. "There's an emotional depth here that I rarely encounter." When night fell, the auditorium was completely packed. Helen watched from the wings the elegant audience, music critics in the front row, students and teachers scattered throughout the space. The concert dress borrowed from the school was simple, but she had never felt more elegant. Claudio found her in the final moments before she went on stage. "Helen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to apologize for what I said last week. I was wrong, completely wrong." Helen looked at him, seeing vulnerability where there had been only arrogance before. "You couldn't have known." "I should have seen." He shook his head. "For 10 years you were here, surrounded by music, and I treated you as invisible. That says more about me than about you." The conductor appeared, indicating it was time to begin. Helen took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and felt Sophia's comforting presence in the audience. When she opened her eyes, there was a serene determination in her gaze. She walked to the stage with firm steps. The lights enveloped her like a warm embrace, and the expectant silence of the audience was almost palpable. She sat at the piano, adjusted herself on the bench, and positioned her hands on the keys. The conductor raised his baton, The orchestra began the majestic introduction of the concerto, and then came the moment, her entrance, the moment when 20 years of silence would be broken before hundreds of people. Helen's trembling hands found the piano keys for the first time in 20 years, and when the first chord echoed through the packed auditorium, the silence that followed was more deafening than any applause she had ever received. But it was only for a moment. Then the music exploded from her like water from a burst dam. Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2 flowed through her hands with a passion that made the composer himself seem present in the auditorium. Each note carried the pain of deferred dreams, the strength of accepted sacrifices, the beauty of motherhood bravely embraced, and now, the devastating joy of a second chance. During the second movement, tears streamed down Helen's face, but she continued playing. In the audience, Sophia cried openly, finally understanding who her mother really was. Claudio, standing in the wings, discreetly wiped his own eyes. The orchestra musicians played with renewed inspiration, fueled by the emotional energy emanating from the piano. When they reached the third movement, something magical happened. Helen was no longer playing just for the audience. She was playing for the 22-year-old who had tucked her dreams away in a leather portfolio, for the single mother who had cleaned floors for 10 years without losing her dignity, for all the women who had chosen to sacrifice their dreams for their children, and for everyone who had ever been considered invisible. The final cadenza approached, the most challenging moment of the piece, where the pianist is alone, without the orchestra, completely exposing their talent and vulnerability. Helen's hands danced over the keys, with an agility that defied the 2 decades of silence. It was as if each year of waiting had only intensified her connection with the music. When the last notes echoed through the auditorium, a silence of several seconds followed. Helen remained motionless, her hands still on the keys, barely able to believe what she had just done. Then, like a wave crashing against the rocks, the applause exploded. The entire audience rose to its feet, the clapping echoing like thunder. Sophia was the first to reach the stage, running through the side aisles to embrace her mother. "I always knew," she whispered in her ear. "I always knew you were extraordinary." The applause continued for more than 5 minutes. Music critics, who had come with low expectations for a last-minute replacement, were now taking frantic notes. The conductor embraced Helen warmly, whispering, "You brought Rachmaninoff back to life today." In the days that followed, Helen's performance became legend in the local music community. Offers for performances began to arrive, not many, but enough. A private music school offered her a position as a piano teacher. An independent record label expressed interest in recording an album of romantic pieces performed by her. But the deepest change wasn't in external opportunities. Helen had rediscovered an essential part of herself that she thought was lost forever. She began giving private piano lessons at home, discovering that teaching music was almost as rewarding as playing it. Sophia, inspired by her mother's courage, decided to apply for music school, following in the footsteps Helen had abandoned decades ago. Claudio, transformed by what he had witnessed, implemented a program at the school where staff could audit music classes for free. "I never want to assume I know who someone really is again," he told Helen during a conversation months later. "You taught me that talent blooms in the most unexpected places." Scene start. EXT. Helen's home. Golden autumn afternoon. 6 months after that transformative night, Helen is in her living room, which she's converted into a small studio, teaching piano to an 8-year-old student, Lily. Lily is struggling with a simple Bach piece, frustrated with her own inexperience. Lily, tears in her eyes, "Miss Helen, what if I never get it right?" Helen stops playing and kneels beside Lily. "Helen, can I tell you a secret? When I was your age, I also thought I'd never be good enough. And you know what I discovered years later?" Lily shakes her head, curious. Helen, I discovered that music isn't in our hands or our technique, it's in our hearts. And when you play with your heart, people will feel it, even if you miss a few notes. E.N.T. Helen's home bought it. Evening later that evening, after her last student has left, Helen sits at the piano she bought with the money from her first post-comeback performances. It's a used instrument, with a few slightly out-of-tune keys, but to her, it's more precious than any Steinway. Sophia is in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and humming a melody Helen played earlier. The sound of her daughter singing blends with the aromas of home-cooked food, creating a domestic symphony more beautiful than any concert. Helen begins to play Chopin's Nocturnes softly, the same piece she played that first night in the school auditorium. But now the music has a different flavor. It's no longer burdened by the weight of lost dreams, but filled with gratitude for dreams rediscovered. Each note celebrates not only her rediscovered talent, but the courage to believe it's never too late to start over. Through the window, the sun sets behind the city buildings, painting the sky with golden and rosy hues. Helen smiles, knowing that this isn't an end, but a new beginning. At 52, she has learned that dreams don't have expiration dates. They simply wait patiently for the right moment to blossom again. And in the quiet of that evening, as her hands dance over the keys, and Sophia hums in the kitchen, Helen understands that she has found something more valuable than fame or recognition. She has found herself again. Music was just the way back home. Scene end.